This video is all about why grading is degrading education. It's all about university assessment practices and the mistakes we're making right now. Now, I haven't made a video for a while, and that's because I've been a bit buried in the task of marking student work. And that's a big chunk of work. It's getting bigger and bigger each year because we get more and more students each year. And we've had this problem for a while because ever since the 1980s, student enrollments have been going up, but staff numbers haven't. Why are more people studying at university? Well, it's because the nature of work is becoming more precarious, fast-changing, complicated, and workers need specific skills to adapt to a fast-changing economy, and those skills are seen as needing to be taught at a university level. Now, generally, the university sector has been slow to catch up to all of this, and the shift that's needed is a move away from teaching content, the thing we call subject knowledge, and to move towards teaching key skills like problem solving, critical thinking, communication skills, IT skills, that sort of stuff. And that's because the knowledge base is moving so quickly, and that's due to rapid technological and societal change. So that what's useful knowledge today is useless knowledge tomorrow. What's needed is not just a shift away from teaching content, but also a shift in how we assess student learning. We need to move away from using grades. Stop using grades in assessing student work. And that shift is kind of not really happening at all. Now, grades are those systems of awarding a letter from a range of letters to sum up a student's learning. There's this A to F scale. It's commonly used in the US and the UK, and there's the HD, which means high distinction, through to F scale, used in Australia. Fs in all of those instances stand for fail. And grades are often allocated based on a numerical mark, often a percentage score or a mark out of 100. So less than 50% generally is a fail, greater than 80% is an A or an HD. But these scales vary. So in my university, you need 85% or more to get an HD. Now, we need to stop doing this. We need to stop allocating grades and marks to student work. And saying that we need to stop grading student work sounds really quite outrageous. Well, it sounds outrageous to some people. But some universities are already doing this. They've actually shifted away from grading student work. I don't know of any in Australia, where I am, but there are quite a few of them in the US, for example, like the really prestigious Brown University, where students can opt out of grading systems and receive tutor-written testimonies on their performance instead. Even if a student decides they want to have a grade for their work, the institution doesn't record F grades, so they won't record fail grades. Other universities, like Alverno College in the US, they don't grade at all. They've got rid of grades entirely. But what's wrong with grading student work? For a long time, employers have been complaining that grades that students come out of university with are meaningless, that they don't tell them anything about how likely someone will be successful in a particular job. Employers instead rely on references and their own methods of assessing a candidate. They generally don't pay much attention to a person's university grade. It doesn't mean much to most employers. Why is grading seen as useless by employers, and actually not just employers, but they're an important group of people for university graduates? Why do they think that grading is so useless? Well, if you assess a student's ability to name parts of the brain, they're going to get the naming either right or wrong. You know, you can pretty well objectively score if someone is answering correctly or incorrectly. In fact, you can get a computer to do it. You just feed it the answer sheet, and then the computer can mark the student's work and give them a grade, a mark out of 100. How many of the 100 questions did you get right? And then convert that into a grade. And that's all fine and dandy. But if students are being asked to demonstrate their critical thinking skills, say, for example, by discussing what's wrong with the practice of naming parts of the brain, there's no right or wrong answer here. So there's no right or wrong answer to that question in that sort of objective sense. There are just good and bad arguments, and the assessment of that is dependent on the person who's marking the assessment, and depending on the marker thinking if an argument is good or bad, or believing an argument to be right or wrong. The argument isn't right or wrong in an objective sense. It can't be measured objectively, and you can't calibrate it on an objective scale. It's marked subjectively by the marker, because it's down to the marker's judgment about whether it's a good or bad argument. Using grading scales gives this false impression that actually what's happening is an objective evaluation, where it's not. Now, universities are increasingly moving from assessing students' content knowledge to assessing student skills. Actually, it's all about assessing student skills these days. And more marking is shifting away from those types of tests, like a multiple choice test where there's a right or wrong answer, and moving more to asking students to demonstrate an argument and so on. So it's shifting more to those assessments that assess skills that are subjectively assessed. So university marking is becoming more subjective. Universities tend to generally pretend that this isn't happening. It tries to hide how marking is subjective. It hides it from students, and it hides it from staff, and it hides it through processes like moderation. And here you get two academics who mark the same piece of work, and that's apparently supposed to be a means to determine the true objective mark for that piece of work. The problem is that generally, markers never come up with the same mark as each other. In fact, they often come up with very different marks, and that's because academics are not cloned. They have different levels of experience, they draw on different skill bases, and they make different judgments about the same thing. That experience and skill base that academics have, that's their subjectivity, and that's what they use to assess a student's work. And no two academics are alike. They tend to be independently minded people. Indeed, university requires them to be independently minded, to be different from their peers. It's a key part of the way that folk are socialized into academia, and that's most evident in the PhD, which many academics now are required to hold, and which requires academics to show how they think differently from everyone else. So it's no wonder that two academics will come up with different marks for the same piece of work. But all of this is generally hidden from students. Students tend only to see their final mark. They won't see the original mark and the moderator's mark. They won't see the disparity between the two marks. And the reason given for hiding those marks from students is it'll just confuse them. It'll confuse the student. And yes, it would confuse the student because students are being told that their work is being marked objectively, when actually it's not. And there's actually nothing wrong with marking work subjectively. You can't do anything else when you're assessing skills. Anyway, academics, however, they also get confused by all of this. And they can find it really unsettling, even alarming for them. They actually do get to see these marks. They see their mark and they see the other marker's mark. And many react to seeing another colleague's grade being so different from theirs that they think, oh God, I suck at my job. And this most often happens in that process of moderation. It's all quite nonsensical because the two markers come together, their marks are very different, and they end up coming up with a final mark, which is usually some sort of average between the two marks, which is a purely arbitrary mark that they come up with. And having two markers doesn't result in a more objective mark. it just results in 2 subjective marks and then a final mark, which is some weird combination of both of them. But sometimes they just split it in the middle. Now, there are cases where markers do come up with similar marks when they're marking a piece of work independently, but that usually only happens when they use a less discriminating scale, like they mark out of 10 rather than mark out of 100. You know, there's less possibility of them coming up with a different mark. But that's not a sign of them finding a true objective mark. And if you do have 2 academics who come up with the same grade for the same piece of work, all that tells you is that those 2 markers believe the same thing to be true. It doesn't make the thing necessarily to be true. It's not an objective mark that they're coming up with. It just means that those 2 people believe so-and-so to be true, that their mark is correct. It's not more objective. It's just coincidental. It's actually quite rare for 2 markers to come up with the same mark, especially when they're marking out of 100. Now, I've been seeing this for the entire time I've worked as an academic, which is getting on for some 30 years now. But the point I really woke up to all of this was when I worked as an external examiner to a number of universities in the UK. Now, the role of the external examiner is to be an external moderator of university marking. That's a role you have in addition to being employed as an academic in your own institution. And you would once or twice a year go visit other universities for a couple of days to moderate their marking. So I'd visit a university, they would give me huge piles of work to look through, and I would look at the work, the mark that was awarded, the feedback that was given, and say whether I thought the marking was fair, consistent, and of the standard expected in the university sector. An important part of that role was to look at undergraduate and postgraduate dissertations. Now, because those dissertations are big pieces of work, they tended to have 2 markers. So all of the dissertations were double marked independently. So you'd have 2 markers who would mark the work independently, then they come together to agree on the final mark. And every year in every university where I was an external examiner, I would see the same thing. I would find that the 2 markers for a dissertation would come up with marks that were almost identical, and sometimes they were actually identical. So why am I telling you that? And I just told you the opposite, and I'm telling you that I'm wrong? I've just completely disparaged everything I've just previously said? Well, no. What was happening, because I had, I was paid to closely look at this stuff. When I took a closer look, I could see that each marker had changed their original mark. What was happening was that markers were coming up with very different marks initially for the same piece of work. And then when they came together and looked at each other's marks, they got a bit embarrassed, unsettled over how different their marks were. And then they would change their individual marks to look as though their marks are either same or very similar. So that meant that when they came to their agreed mark, they didn't have to shift very much. Neither of them had to they didn't appear to shift very much. They thought this would look better when an external examiner like me came and looked at it. In essence, what they were doing, they were fixing their marks to look as though they were more in agreement than they actually were. And then they came to their agreed mark, which was a tiny shift. You gave it a 65, I gave it a 68. Hey, let's give it, a 67. Yeah, that's what they were doing. When actually, one marker was given at 50, the other marker was given at 75, and then somehow they thought, we'll go in the middle, and let's just move our original marks a bit closer to the middle. So they were fixing their marks. They were just not very good at hiding the fact. But there's also another way markers would do this, and it was much more subtle, and I couldn't detect it as an external examiner, but I did see it as a university lecturer. It's what I called the handover technique, and here's how it worked. So you get appointed as the second marker for a dissertation. The first marker would mark the work, and then they would hand the dissertation over to you. Now, they weren't allowed to tell you what mark they gave because you're supposed to mark independently from them. But when they handed over the mark, the dissertation, they'd hand over the dissertation, they'd say something like, "Hiya, Paul, here's the dissertation. I think you'll enjoy this one. It's brilliant." I.e., in so many words, this one's an HD. This one's an A grade. Or, "Here's the dissertation, Paul. It is what it is, good luck marking this one." Whew. I don't envy you. And that was code for this one's a marginal pass, maybe a fail. It was like a hidden handshake. And people did this to avoid the embarrassment of you coming up with a very different mark to them. That wouldn't result in you giving identical marks because it was it was a nod and a wink, but it was a way to reduce the likelihood of you giving a very different mark. Someone gives you a dissertation, say, "Oh, you're going to love this one, Paul. Oh, it's brilliant." You're going to be less likely to give it a fail grade because in the back of your mind, you're thinking, "Oh, the other marker thinks this is brilliant." So you're less likely to give it a fail. I mean, this is what was going on. Staff weren't, it's not dishonesty. What was happening was they were reacting to pressure from their university to come up with similar marks because the institution expected that this process was the means to ensure that the student gets the right mark, their true mark, their objectively true mark. And the process of having two markers, second markers, also moderation, was to ensure the marking was objective. So if you come up with very different marks, first marker comes up with a different mark to the second marker, they'll both get a bit worried that their marking is wrong, and so they'll do what they have to do. But all of this is a nonsense. All of this is a nonsense, coming up with a true objective mark for the piece of work. It can only really happen when you have something like a multiple choice test, where there is a very clear right and wrong answer. For a lot of assessments, there's no right or wrong answer. There's just an informed opinion that the assessor makes. It's an informed judgment. And two academics will come up with different views of the same piece of work. So that's the big problem. Marking is increasingly subjective, but is being made out to be objective. There's nothing wrong in marking being subjective, but it's when you're pretending that it isn't, that's where the problem is. Now, there are some big consequences of using grading scales that makes this a much bigger problem than something about disingenuity. So I'm going to list four points that I think highlight the bigger problem with grading student work. So first, it makes students risk averse because they have a fear of losing marks. But education is actually all about failing and then learning from your mistakes. If we don't make mistakes because we're too frightened of failing, then we don't learn. So grading can actually degrade the learning experience. And that's a cracking title. I'm going to use that as the title. Grading degrades work. Okay, number two, second big problem. Grades end up becoming identity tags. They are taken to signify a student's social worth in the institution and beyond, actually. So we have students who receive fail grades or even pass grades who drop out of university because they just don't think they're good enough to be at university. And you get students who get A's or HDs thinking that they are the right stuff. They're a great student, they're a brilliant student. And you find students introducing themselves to staff as HD or A grade students. And you get staff introducing students to other staff as A grade students. And this is a process where the grades are becoming ossified into the student's identity. And the student becomes the grade. And it shuts down any consideration of the student's potential to change. Either for a student who gets a fail grade, here we go, fail student, a student who gets a fail grade, it cuts down the possibility of them turning in a brilliant piece of work and becoming a brilliant student, or an A grade student becoming a dumb student. It doesn't allow people to change and grow. It's got a really powerful effect in that way. It acts as this self-fulfilling prophecy in many cases. Give a student an F grade and they turn into an F grade student, and then they leave university early. They drop out. And grades interfere with this main goal of education, which is about having the opportunity for growth, to change. Grades lock us down into a type. It limits our chances for growth. Third point. I've only got four, so Two more coming. So grades become more important than the learning. Students often only attempt to learn something if they're going to get grades for doing it and getting marks for doing it. And often that narrows down rather than broadens the learning experience. When students attend tutorials, this is so my experience for such a long time. It's so frustrating. They come to tutorials and the only questions they ask are questions in relation to assessments. And it leads to really dull conversations, and it leads to you don't have class discussions, you just get Q&A, questions and answers with the tutor. Student asks a question about the assessment, tutor answers it. So say you've got an essay that asks students to consider the impact that the Holocaust had on how psychology developed as a discipline. So that's the essay, okay? And that's the topic. What questions do students generally ask? They'll ask, how many references should I use for that essay? Or will I lose marks if I don't format it in a particular style? And they're quite dull questions, you know, and it interferes with the learning process because the marks become more important than the learning. It shuts down people's intellectual curiosity and it puts their imagination in the chill cabinet. Fourth problem, final one that I can think of just now. A grade is a very poor form of feedback. It reduces down all of the marker's thoughts about an assessment into a crude numerical mark or grade. And the grade is prioritized. So when markers are under pressure, they come up with a grade first. And then if they have time, they will come up with the qualitative feedback. But that's always secondary. Sometimes they don't come up with a qualitative feedback at all, such as with exams, where students often don't receive any qualitative feedback, they just receive a numerical mark. And that's because exams tend to happen right at the end of term and there's a bit of a rush to get the grading done, and often that means that qualitative feedback is left out. Grades and marks are very poor forms of feedback. It lacks the nuance that you need to tell you about your learning. And it gives you very little information other than apparently whether you were better or worse than other people. That's generally all it tells you. Given all these problems with grading work, what other reasons might there be for us carrying on doing it in higher education, or in education more generally? Well, this video is way too long. Oh my God. So much for doing short videos. Okay, so this video is too long. So I'm not ducking out of that question, but I've got an answer for it. But I have to stop this video. You've got other stuff to get on with. And I've got to grade more work. But I'd be interested in your suggestions. Why do you think this is going on? So leave comments in the comment box in the YouTube channel. Or you could ask me to make another video and ask me to make a video about why I think we do this. Why we continue to mark and grade students' work in spite of the damage it does to student learning, and how employers aren't at all interested in this form of assessing students' skills. Okay, let's leave it there. So thanks for sticking with me. I need to get the air conditioning on. So yeah, hopefully get another video out a little sooner. Okay, thanks very much. See you later. Ta-da.